There is a kind of exhaustion you cannot clearly explain to anyone, not the kind that comes from a long workday, nor from any specific event that just happened. You get enough sleep, you still do what needs to be done, everything appears fine on the surface. Yet there is a quiet feeling that your energy never truly returns the way it used to. You can notice it in very small moments when you've just finished replying to one email and 3 more tasks immediately appear, when you're about to sit down for a short rest and suddenly remember something unfinished, when you end a day in which nothing particularly bad happened, but there was never a moment when you were truly at ease. And the strange thing is, you cannot point to a clear cause. There is no single major problem big enough to explain that feeling. There is no obvious incident you can say, this is the reason. If you were born somewhere between the late 1970s and the mid-1980s, you might begin to recognize something. The fatigue you feel does not come from one single source. It comes from living in a state that very few people experience in quite the same way you do. You are the generation that grew up in a world with pauses, but came of age in a world that never turns off. You know what silence feels like, yet now you live in an environment where everything constantly demands a response. You once had stretches of time where you were completely unreachable, but now you are almost always accessible at any moment. And perhaps what is exhausting you is not your job, not your family, nor any single responsibility on its own. It is all of these things happening at the same time, within a system that no longer has any real pause. And if you have ever felt this way, a kind of fatigue that lingers, quiet but persistent, then perhaps, for the first time, you are beginning to hear a real explanation for it. There is something very specific that, if you pay attention, you will immediately notice your body is no longer tired in the usual way. It is not the kind of fatigue that comes after a physically demanding day, not something you can fix with a good night's sleep. It feels more like a thin layer of exhaustion that is always there, from morning to night, from one day to the next. And you cannot pinpoint exactly where it began. And perhaps the answer does not lie in what you are doing now, but in what you used to be accustomed to. You clearly remember what it felt like for a day to truly end. Not just finishing work, but a real ending. You would go home, have dinner, turn on the TV, and gradually everything would slow down. No more emails would appear after that. No one was waiting for your response. If the landline didn't ring, the world almost stopped there. You went to sleep without your mind holding onto a list of things that might need to be handled later. You also remember empty spaces not because you tried to create them, but because they naturally existed. Sitting in a car, looking out the window, doing nothing, waiting for someone at a meeting point with no way of knowing where they were, walking, cycling, or simply sitting still without anything interrupting your thoughts. And most importantly, you did not feel uncomfortable in those spaces. You did not feel the need to fill them. Those things were not a lifestyle. They were how your nervous system was shaped. You were used to a rhythm with gaps between an action and a response, between one day and the next, between you and the rest of the world. But now, if you look at a normal day of your life, you will see that those gaps no longer exist. You wake up, and from that moment, everything has already begun. Your phone may already have notifications before you even open your eyes. You step into work, and there is no clear point where you can say, it's done. Only a continuous chain of tasks flowing into one another. You reply to one email, then a message arrives. You finish one task, and another immediately replaces it. By evening, you may no longer be working, but your mind has not shut off. You still think about unfinished tasks, things that need responses, things that might happen tomorrow. You put your phone down, but a few minutes later, you pick it up again, not because there is something new, but because you are no longer used to nothing happening. And this, the disappearance of pauses, is what is exhausting you. Not because you are doing too many big things, but because you no longer have moments where your mind and body are completely off. A part of you is still waiting for a familiar signal that today has truly ended, that you can disconnect without missing anything. But that signal no longer appears, and you are not resisting this. You are still adapting, still keeping up, still functioning within this rhythm every day. But if you are honest with yourself, you will recognize something very clearly. You are not tired because you have become weaker. You are tired because you once lived in a world where rest was natural, and now you are trying to rest in a world that no longer knows how to stop. If you peel back another layer of this exhaustion, you will see that it does not come only from the pace of life or from work, but from the very position you occupy in your life, a position that is difficult to step away from and impossible to lighten. You are no longer in the phase where you only have to take care of yourself. Behind you are your parents, people who are beginning to slow down, beginning to need you in ways they never did before. It may be a doctor's appointment, a financial decision, or simply a phone call that you know. If you don't answer, no one else will understand well enough to help them, and you cannot take these things lightly, because you know that time on that side is no longer as abundant as it once was. But at the same time, in front of you are your children who do not only need to be cared for, but need to be guided through a world that you yourself did not grow up in. Their questions are no longer simple. The risks are no longer obvious, and you must be present not only physically, but mentally, to listen, to guide, to make sure they do not lose their way in an environment that is too complex. And in between those two is your work, not a choice, but the foundation that allows everything else to function. You cannot let go of it, even when you are tired. You cannot pause it, even when you need to. It is always there, steady, yet demanding, consistent, yet never truly light. What makes all of this heavy is not each part on its own. It is the fact that they all happen at the same time. You may be in a meeting, but your mind is thinking about calling your parents back. You may be at home with your children, but part of you has not left work. You may be trying to rest, but there is always a subtle feeling that something is still waiting for you to handle. There is no moment when you are truly outside of all these things. And that is the key point. You are not just doing many things. You are being pulled into many roles at the same time, continuously, without pause. You are the child who needs to be present. You are the parent who needs to stay strong. You are the person who must keep work from falling apart. And each of those roles is valid, necessary, deserved, but none of those roles asks whether you still have enough energy, so you keep going. You do what needs to be done. You keep everything running. And from the outside, nothing is really wrong. But inside, you begin to feel a very deep kind of fatigue, not because of one long day, but because you have been in this state for too long without a clear stopping point. You are not collapsing. You are simply never truly at rest. And perhaps the hardest part is not what you are carrying. It is that no one truly sees everything you are carrying at once. You are present everywhere others need you, but there is nowhere where you can fully set yourself down. And there is one more thing. If you look closely at the path you have taken, you will notice something very specific. It is not that you chose the wrong direction, but that you started out right at the moment when the world itself began to shift. In the late 1990s, when you were about to leave school or had just entered university, there was a very clear sense of certainty in the air. Adults spoke about the future as something almost guaranteed. Finish your studies, find a job, gradually settle into stability. The internet was rising. Technology was talked about as an opportunity, not a risk. If you were at that point in time, you almost believed you were stepping into a favorable era. But then the year 2000 happened. You may not have started working yet, or you may have just begun, but you could see the signs clearly. Tech companies that had once been everywhere suddenly disappeared. People who graduated just a few years before you, those who should have already been stable, were taking temporary jobs or working outside their fields. You began hearing phrases like not hiring, downsizing, uncertain conditions. And for the first time, you felt that the road ahead was no longer as continuous as you had imagined. Then came 2001, and things were no longer just about the economy. 9/11 was not just a news event. If you were at that age, you remember exactly where you were when you heard about it, maybe in a classroom, a dorm room, or your first workplace. The atmosphere changed instantly. It was not only fear, it was the realization that the world was no longer stable in the way you once believed. Industries were affected. Hiring slowed down, everything became more cautious, and you were right at the starting point, just when you needed opportunity. The world began to pull back. You kept going. You had no other choice. You looked for work, adapted, accepted jobs that did not fully match your original plans, believing that things would eventually stabilize, and for a while, it seemed like they did. You began to find more stable work, You started thinking about saving, buying a home, building a long-term foundation. For the first time, you may have felt like you were catching up. Then 2008 happened. This time, it was no longer distant. It unfolded directly in your life. You saw colleagues being laid off. You saw friends who had just bought homes forced to sell or become trapped in debt. Companies once considered stable began to shake, and even if you were not directly affected, you could clearly see that it could just as easily happen to you. The important thing is not each event on its own, it is the timing of them. All of these things happened precisely when you were building the first foundation of your life at the moment you needed stability the most to begin. Stability itself did not exist, and just when you managed to rebuild part of it, it was challenged all over again. So you are not simply behind in time. You were forced to rebuild multiple times, from your career, to your plans, to the way you think about the future. And this leaves a very specific feeling that not everyone understands. You may still move forward, still achieve what you need, but you never feel like you have gone through a seamless journey. There is always a break somewhere. There is always a point where you had to stop, adjust, and start again from a different place. And over time, this changes how you see everything. You no longer fully believe in a perfect path. You no longer see stability as something guaranteed. You still hope, but you no longer place all your trust in a single scenario. And if there are moments when you feel like you have to try harder than others just to reach what should have come naturally, then that feeling may not be subjective at all. You are not moving slower. You simply stepped into life at a time when the world kept shifting beneath your feet. Perhaps there is one thing even harder to put into words than everything you have been through that almost no one has ever truly named it. You are not part of the younger generation that is constantly mentioned in every discussion. No one analyzes you in the media. No one tries to decode you. But you are also not part of a generation that is fully settled, seen as having already finished its part. You are not at the beginning of the story, nor at the end. You are in the middle, and the middle is rarely told. When people talk about the pressures of the young, you understand. When people talk about the stability of earlier generations, you understand that too. But rarely does anyone talk about what you feel, the experience of carrying many things at once, in silence, without even having a clear name for it. So you keep going. You still do what needs to be done. You still show up where you are expected to be. You keep everything running, as if it were simply natural. And from the outside, nothing looks wrong. There is no major crisis, no obvious collapse, only a kind of fatigue, steady, persistent, that you have grown used to carrying without speaking about it, because no one asks in a way that goes deep enough, and you are not used to stopping to explain it. And over time, it becomes part of how you live. You carry it, you adjust to it, you keep moving forward with it. But perhaps, for the first time, this needs to be said clearly. You are not the only one who feels this way, and that feeling is not imaginary. You are simply carrying a kind of pressure that not many people can see because you carry it so quietly. You keep showing up, fulfilling your roles, keeping everything stable. So from the outside, no one realizes how much you have had to adjust to make that possible. And perhaps that is the deepest reason. You have become so used to carrying everything in silence that no one realizes you are carrying it at all. And perhaps, after everything, the most important thing is not to find a way to fix this feeling, but to understand where it comes from. You are not tired because you are weaker. You are not out of place because you are different. You are simply one of the few who have lived through two completely different worlds, a world with pauses and a world that never stops. And you are carrying both within the same nervous system. That is not a flaw. It is a rare form of awareness. You know what true silence feels like. You know what it means for a day to actually end. You know what connection feels like when it does not have to be constant. And in a world that is becoming faster, louder, and more demanding, perhaps those are the things that truly hold value. So maybe you do not need to keep trying to keep up with everything. Maybe you do not need to force yourself to fully align with the current pace of life. Maybe what you need is simply to allow yourself to keep a part of the old rhythm. Moments of rest without needing a reason. Times when you do not respond immediately. Moments when you do not have to be available for anyone. Not to escape this life, but to be able to continue living in it, without losing yourself. And if there is one thing you can take with you after all of this, it may be something very simple. You are not falling behind. You are not being left behind. You are simply carrying more than others can see. And the fact that you keep going, keep everything running, keep showing up every day, is already something significant. If you recognize yourself in these words, remember that you are not alone, and sometimes, just understanding that is already a form of rest.